Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those of you joining us from Europe or from Africa and not on the east coast of the United States or west coast of the United States. My name is Bettina Hausmann. I'm the president and CEO of our United Nations Association in San Diego, and I'm thrilled to welcome you today. We are located here in San Diego on the land of the Kumeyaay people, and we're paying our respect to them for us being able to welcome you today to our expert panel on catalyzing private sector engagement, and particularly how do we move the needle together on sustainability. So you will hear from our expert panel today a lot about the ESGs, which are the environmental social governance, and you will learn a bit more on background, what ESGs stand for and what the business community is trying to achieve with the ESG implementation. Just in a nutshell for all of us, before we dive into more what ESG stand for, it is truly a translation of the Sustainable Development Goals that we all are very familiar with, particularly here in this forum on the Commission on the Status of Women. It is a translation from the SDGs into a business context. So how do international businesses or businesses in general will be working towards sustainability? So that's a very crucial conversation we have today, particularly as we learned over the past few weeks, the increased focus on businesses and the ask to walk the walk on their commitment to environment and social governance, as we are learning from the crisis in Ukraine, how important it is that businesses, investors, and also us as citizens are working towards sustainability that comes with also peace and security. With that, I'd like to hand it over to our moderator. We are thrilled to have from S&P Global Sustainable One, Esther Hall here to moderate today our expert panel. And we do have Esther Wilston, who is also from S&P Global Sustainable One, and she will be providing us some insight onto ESG. Esther, you have the floor.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Lindsay and I are both really glad to be here. Before I start sharing, as I'm starting to share my screen, let me just do a quick disclaimer, which is the views I'm saying here are my own and that of Sustainable One, not of S&P Global Ratings. So let me get the screen share. Can you all see it fine? Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about connecting the dots between ESG and SDGs. And as Bettina said, they really have a lot in common, I think. And I think a lot of the people and groups who are looking to make SDGs happen, these kind of moonshot concepts, I think they have an opportunity to partner with companies more on this because they're also looking to make many of these things happen. All right, so what is ESG? So it's 3 buckets: environmental, social, and governance. And really there's a lot of things that can fall under that, but really it's a concept or a process by which companies and investors think about how they can run their business in a sustainable way, both for the short term and the longer term. And it includes things like environmental topics, include things like climate change, water management, biodiversity, the circular economy, like reducing waste, and also the just transition. You can't leave people behind as you're addressing environmental issues. Then there's the social issues, which I think also fit a lot into the buckets we're talking about here. They include gender diversity, workplace safety, environmental justice, and even corporate lobbying practices, which, investors want to see companies kind of following through on their messaging, what they're telling the public. They want them to be showing that they're being consistent in what they're telling lawmakers or what groups they're in. And this concept of ESG has been around for decades, particularly in Europe, but it's picked up a lot of steam globally over the past few years. And you'll find that the concepts and terms of ESG are coming up just about every time you hear a company have an annual meeting, their quarterly calls, and even, their meetings with investors behind the scenes. So what's driving this change? Well, there's evolving disclosure expectations and regulations. Just this morning, I listened to the US Securities and Exchange Commission vote to propose a rule requiring corporate climate disclosures. The European Union is working on regulations and has passed several, including the SFDR, or the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. There's a bunch of voluntary frameworks that companies are using to do their climate disclosures, including one of the most popular ones is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFDs, which you'll often hear it referred to as. And it started off as a voluntary framework, but really a lot of regulators and stock exchanges are starting to say, well, you need to have your disclosures aligned with the TCFD's recommendations. So it's sort of moving into more of a mandatory type of structure. And another big driver here is investors, they need to have information about how companies are handling these risks to make their decisions about which ones to invest in, right? They want to know which companies meet their ESG or green or sustainability investment strategies. We also have changing social norms and expectations. As we know, a lot has changed in the last few years, especially with the pandemic. But workers are increasingly becoming more aware of what their company's goals and progress and activities are, and they want to be at companies that align with what those employees think are their values. We saw in 2019 sort of a sea change, like a real marker was when the US Business Roundtable, this is a group of publicly traded CEOs of publicly traded companies, the biggest in the US, they put out this letter saying they need to work on stakeholder capitalism. It's this concept that companies should focus on benefits to all stakeholders. So it's customers, employees, suppliers, communities, shareholders, rather than just getting money for shareholders. Also driving the change is the growing scientific understanding and companies paying attention to the scientific news of what's happening. So when the IPCC put out its 1.5 degree interim report in 2018, we saw afterwards, the report said that to achieve 1.5 degrees, we needed to limit global warming to we needed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And within about a year of that report coming out, we started seeing companies announce net zero emissions targets. And I think we have more than 1,500 companies now, as well as some governments have announced it. So this really can be hugely influential. I heard someone last week refer to the IPCC reports as sort of the Bible of what companies need to do. So I think they're taking it very seriously, and it's really driving a lot of change. And in turn, investors, their engagement and their expectations of companies is also changing. So it's a common topic at annual meetings. I used to have to word search to find in meetings where this topic would come up, and now I don't. I just pick a company and it's in there. And investors are increasingly willing to sort of follow through on their threat to divest and or to kick out board members. So last year, investors, including BlackRock, voted in support of booting 3 of ExxonMobil's board directors from their board of directors, and they replaced them with people who had climate-friendly backgrounds. Now, granted, it was a minority, right, at the company, but it sent a real message to both ExxonMobil and also to companies writ large that investors are not going to just put up with tiny incremental changes that don't really get the company in the right direction, if that's their view, of course. And I think sort of like SDGs, ESG issues are interconnected, right? You can't address climate change without thinking about a just transition. Can't leave communities behind. And not only that, we can't do greater harm to those who are already struggling. And supply chains are a similar thing. We have both climate and human rights issues. So companies, both the products they get, as well as the ability to deliver them, they're dependent on transportation infrastructure, which is going to be greatly affected by climate change, is already being affected by it. And then, we've seen all kinds of human rights issues come up, like what's happened in China and other things with prohibitions on buying supplies from those regions. So companies really need to think very holistically about sort of every aspect of which they do business. And then, I think within this also, this is another example. This is a quote from the IPCC report itself, talking about how addressing gender inequality is really crucial to climate adaptation. They said they listed gender inequality, SDG 5, and discrimination, SDG 16, both as barriers to effective adaptation. And adaptation refers to becoming more resistant or resilient to the physical impacts of climate change, like hurricanes, wildfires, flooding, things like that. I also think that everyone is beginning to acknowledge that the private and public sectors face many of the same challenges, right? Climate change is affecting everybody, both households, communities, cities, governments, finance, business, all of it. And everyone is also, society as well as companies are also struggling to deal with gender equity and diversity issues. Biodiversity and natural resources, I mean, that's fundamentally underpins every aspect of what we do, and companies are increasingly understanding that they can't continue to necessarily use up resources. They need to, there's a new term coming out called nature positive, which is not only having a neutral effect on nature, but having a positive impact on it. And there's also a lot of talk happening. We saw at COP26 how climate financing to date, while there is a certain amount of it, a lot of it is being directed towards developed countries and proven technologies, and it needs to expand to include the technologies that companies will need to achieve net zero emissions. There's a lot out there that the CEO of a big company 2 years ago said, we know how to get 80% of the way there, but we're relying on technologies that don't exist to get the rest. So we need that to happen. And here's a chart that was in the IPCC report that I think just really shows how, if you start here at the beginning, past conditions, right? Every year of delayed action on climate change puts the world on a path to exponentially greater losses and damages. The further we go down one of these paths, the more we'll be locked into that one, and the harder it'll be to change the outcome. And so not only do we need to act, but we need to act fast and comprehensively. Next slide. Come on, there we go. But while we need to take on, companies are understanding that while they need to take on climate and social risks on a global scale, and governments and everyone needs to, they also require very locally tailored solutions. What's happening in one community is very different than what's happening in another. And I think this is an area where local organizations, as well as Indigenous knowledge and local communities, can all really work together, not just using the information, but partnering together. This is something companies are looking to do more now, to partner together to try to help address these issues in a way that can benefit everybody. Here's a GIF from a report we did in September 2021. This is by S&P Global True Cost, as well as S&P Global Market Intelligence. And you can see here that these 21 counties, these are the biggest 21 counties by population in the US, and how the kind of climate risks they face are different, right? Miami-Dade, Florida, and Harris, Texas, hurricanes, that's the biggest risk for that. You see this next image here, right? Big risk. But in the West, that's not a big problem. Whereas the next slide, the next image, wildfires, right? In Los Angeles, that's a big risk for them. So different strategies for different locations. There's also a rising focus on social equity issues in the ESG discussion. This idea of human capital management, the way companies treat their workforce. This has been a part of the S part of ESG for a long time, but really it was sort of slightly sidelined until the pandemic. And when the pandemic happened, companies, and I think society, also realized that workers are what make a company the company it is, right? They can't do anything unless they have a workforce, and a happy and healthy workforce. And so they're thinking more about these issues. While a lot of the focus up until, I'd say, like mid-year last year was on gender diversity, it is also expanding to include race and racial equity, especially in the US, when we had George Floyd, a man die in the custody of police, which started sort of the Black Lives Matter movement. It started a real discussion, even in companies and meetings they would have with employees, about how they're addressing these issues and making sure they're not having biases or other things in their practices. Here's a study, just two images, two stats you can see here from a study that S&P Global did in partnership with some other researchers, in which they looked at from 1960 to 2019, if Black women had had the same opportunities for education and then had jobs that matched their education and skill sets, what would that have done for the US economy? Well, for the education side alone, that would have added 107.5 billion US dollars to the GDP by 2019, which is no small change, but it's like 5 times that amount if they had just been put in jobs that they were skilled enough to be in, right? Or qualified for. $507 billion to the US GDP by 2019. So this is an example of both race and gender being an equity issue that really can help the economy if it's addressed right. So all in all, we need all hands on deck, I think is what I'm trying to get across. Achieving SDGs and social equity issues in ESG can't be done alone. No sector or NGO or government can do it by itself. So the question is, how do we bridge that gap? And I think I'll turn it over to Lindsay now to take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Esther, for that lay of the land. So just by way of introduction, Esther is my co-host on the podcast ESG Insider. And in that, we, on a weekly basis, get to interview a wide range of sustainability stakeholders on topics that really run the gamut of the E, the S, and the G. So we talk to people about gender and racial equity. We talk to people about biodiversity and natural capital. And we talk about governance issues like corporate board composition. In addition to hosting this podcast, I'm head of thought leadership at S&P Global Sustainable One, which is S&P Global's single source of essential sustainability intelligence. And in that role, I'm really privileged to talk regularly with stakeholders from across the business world and the public sector. And so we're really privileged today to have such a diverse group of expert panelists all in one place. I'll run through quickly and then I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves in a little more detail. But today we're joined by Kwame Asari, who's founder and CEO of media tech company Fedia. We're also joined by Tatiana Bessarabova, who is co-founder of SDXSpace, which does geospatial and analytics for tracking SDG progress in emerging economies. We're also joined by Leah Silverthorne, who is part of the California Chamber of Commerce as a policy advocate specializing in a range of issues, including climate change, air quality, energy, environmental justice. We're also joined by Parisa Ijadi Magsudi, who's commissioner of the San Diego County Commission on the Status of Women and Girls. And last but not least, by Karen Valencia Clupton, who is chair of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. I'm really looking forward to posing this question to our panelists that we heard Esther asking, which is, how do you bridge that gap between private and public sector? How do you bring together those partnerships in a way that works towards our shared sustainability goals? So before we dive into that conversation, I'd like to get to know each other a little bit better. So I'm going to go around the virtual room and ask each of our panelists to introduce yourself and tell our audience briefly what should they know about your role and your organization. And I want to make sure we have plenty of time for today's dynamic conversation. So I'm going to challenge each of you to do this in about 1 minute or less. But I'd like to start with you, please, Tatiana.
Hi, everyone. I am very pleased to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I have a very interesting background for this particular conversation, only because, first of all, I was a part of UNA in San Diego before I moved to New York, where I started working for the UN Development Program. And I've worked for about 6 years on the transition from the Millennium Development Goal framework to the Sustainable Development Goals framework at UNDP. Back then, the word private sector collaboration was a dirty phrase to use at the UN, because the role of the private sector was not yet recognized. So having worked for UN Development Program for about 6 years, I left and then worked on the other side of the equation, working with companies and consulting for Fortune 500 companies that were looking to implement SDGs, incorporate SDGs and positive social impact within their value chains. Since then, I've left and co-founded SDXSpace with 2 of my former co-workers from different UN agencies, because all 3 of us have seen the issue of the lack of data in all of this. Whether you're looking at SDGs or ESG, there is a lack of reliable data. And so we're actually working at SDXSpace on this piece of a huge pie that we have to all deal with, the issue of data availability. And we're doing that by using satellite imagery and combining it with other data coming from grassroots organizations and the public sector, the UN, and other local organizations, hopefully including native, organizations that are truly grassroots in the areas. And we're doing that. We combine the data together, and we sell that data to the investors, because we do believe that as much as we try to deny it, financial markets do apply can have the ability to apply a lot of pressure on the private sector to change their practices. So that's what we're doing now. I'll talk a little bit more about it, but more specifically, we're looking at de-risking the electric vehicle supply chain at the moment, because given the energy transition and the geopolitical situation in the world today, there will be a huge push for transitioning to decoupling, to moving away from fossil fuel, and electric vehicles will be the first sort of sector to really boom. It's already booming, obviously, but we often don't realize that producing more electric vehicles also means doing more mining for the critical metals in the vulnerable areas. For example, the majority of cobalt in the world, which is a component in the electric vehicle battery, comes from Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a difficult place when it comes to sustainability and sustainable development. So I'll talk more about our work as we go along, but passing on to other speakers.
Great. Thank you, Tatiana. Let's go next to Parisa, please.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Parisa Ijadi Maksudi. I'm an appointed commissioner on the San Diego County Commission on the Status of Women and Girls. I also serve as a vice chair of the commission. The commission is mandated to study and evaluate areas of concern to women's and girls' lives and needs in San Diego County, and to report findings and recommendations annually to our Board of Supervisors. Since 2019, I have chaired the commission's Cdaw committee, which is focused on intersectional gender justice and the adoption of local ordinances that reflect the United Nations Cdaw, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and also the goal of furthering intersectional gender justice. By training, I'm a poverty attorney. I'm licensed in California, and for over the past decade, I focused on representing individuals and nonprofit organizations in poverty law cases involving fundamental human rights from a race equity perspective. As we know, women are disproportionately adversely impacted by poverty, and individuals in poverty are disproportionately adversely impacted by climate change. So I am very much looking forward to being part of this panel and joining my fellow panelists to learn more about how we can make a lasting change.
Great, thank you so much, Parisa. I'd like to turn next to Karen.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm going to start by acknowledging the land we are on here in San Francisco. We acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land, and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community, and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. And with that, and that show of respect, which I really appreciate, Bettina, beginning our talk today with the tribute to the Indigenous peoples of San Diego, where she is. And so how did we reach that at the Human Rights Commission here in San Francisco? We worked with the tribal leaders under their leadership and guidance, and we continue to do so by building an American Indian cultural district here, as well as looking at reconciliation and land use and returning land to the Ramaytush Ohlone. I'm not only the chair of the Human Rights Commission here in San Francisco, which was founded based on racial inequities in the 60s at the height of the civil rights movement. In addition, I'm Vice President and General Counsel for Incendio International, and we advise corporations on ESG issues and other crisis management concerns. That's called every now and then a puppy might do something interesting in our lives. It keeps things moving. For 10 years, I was Chief Administrative Law Judge for the California Public Utilities Commission. So I can speak today about many successes of collaboration between the private sector, academia, and the government in addressing climate change and environmental issues. And then finally, in terms of governance and ethics, which I think go hand in hand, I served on the commission to revise the rules for professional conduct for all attorneys in the state of California, and there are 250,000 of them. So I look forward to having this important discussion on collaboration.
Thank you, Karen. Next, I'll turn to Kwasi, please.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Kwasi Sari. Currently serve as the CEO of Fedia. We are a marketing and business development agency. I would say social impact is a part of almost every project that we take on. We have a really unique opportunity to kind of cherry pick the products that we work on. And so really try to focus on things that have double or triple bottom lines. My background, I was formerly an institutional investment banker at Citigroup, Sullivan Smith Barney, where I held Series 7, Series 63, and a number of securities licenses. Shortly after that, I made my way to Hollywood and actually started working in media technology. I've sold over 20 million records as parts of teams, marketing artists like P. Diddy, Snoop Dogg, Outkast, Wu-Tang, et cetera, as I served as part of Sony Music's initial social media team, as well as the first new media director at Bad Boy Entertainment. I've also served as the ambassador to Ghana for the Nexus Network. For those of you who are familiar with Nexus, it's an organization that launched out of the UN in 2015 to really focus on the next generation of wealth holders and the transition from, say, the baby boomer generation to Generation X and Z. I've also just worked on a ton of media projects around social impact. Currently, I serve as an executive producer on a documentary that we're currently titling United Nations at 75, Past, Present, and Future, which is a celebration of the UN's accomplishments and hopefully projecting what will be the next 75 years of the UN's legacy. I also created one of the first groups in Clubhouse, for those of you who are Clubhouse users, focused on sustainable development goals. We have more than 40,000 followers and actively support causes across the scope, from climate to human rights, et cetera. And excited to be a part of this conversation. I should also say I serve as an advisor as well to two nonprofits, Cdaw.org, which is working to end period poverty globally, and the Village Community Development Center, which is working to end poverty in West Africa, rural West Africa specifically.
Great, thank you for joining us today. And last but not least, Leah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I am sitting here in sunny Sacramento, California, which is the capital of California, which is the 5th largest economy in the world, and also the ancestral homeland of the Nissenan, Maidu, Miwok, and Miwok peoples, who are indigenous peoples of this land and have lived here since time immemorial. Thanks again for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking with all of you, but more importantly, listening to all of you on how NGOs can better partner with business. You know, we here at the California Chamber of Commerce have been engaging. My predecessor wisely decided to be better at engaging with NGOs and the state on climate policy. And I hope to continue that legacy here. So looking forward to talking to all of you. A little bit about me and my background. I'm a first-generation college student. I've been an environmental lawyer for about 15 years. I've represented a little bit of everything. So I've represented municipalities, I've represented states, I've represented NGOs and nonprofits. And so I'm really looking forward to talking about how you can really take all of those conversations together and enact smart climate policy to help everyone.
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you again, all of you, for joining us today for this really important discussion. Already in our introductions, I'm hearing a lot of overlap between what you, our panelists, are focused on and what the private sector is really focused on in ESG discussions. We heard Tatiana talk about the lack of reliable data, and this is absolutely an issue that we're hearing about all of the time from corporates and investors. They're constantly seeking more data, especially as it relates to climate change, as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, to try and make smart decisions around these issues. We're also, we heard Parisa talk about gender equity. This is something we're seeing investors putting increasing pressure on corporate boards to both diversify within their boards and also across their corporations, and to create policies that really allow for diversity, equity, and inclusion across the business. And then we heard both Karen and Leah talking about the importance of working with Indigenous communities. And as you heard Esther mention, the latest IPCC climate report emphasizes that importance of involving local communities in solutions to combat climate change. So we're talking about all these sort of overlaps and how the private and public sector face many of the same sustainability challenges, but connecting the dots between the two is not always straightforward. So I'd like to hear from our panelists. I'm going to kind of open up the floor and know from your perspective, what is the key sustainability challenge that you encounter in your role? And I'm asking this really with two goals in mind. I want to hear broadly, what is that biggest sustainability challenge? I also really like to know specifically what's the biggest hurdle you see when it comes to working with the private sector as we look for ways to bridge the gap. So I'm going to pose that as an open question to kick off our discussion today. But what are the biggest sustainability challenges that you encounter in your role? We've really got, I would also note, we've really got a mix of panelists here today from both the state, the county, the international level. So I would really love to hear from a range of stakeholders, because we are so privileged to have such a diverse group.
I'm happy to start here, Lindsay. I can talk a little bit about what we're doing here in California. So I'm a senior policy advocate with the California Chamber of Commerce, and I do specialize in climate, energy, air quality. I've been here for about 4 years. And like I said before, my practice was as a private practitioner in environmental law and really representing all sides of the issues. And so I think one of the biggest challenges here, at least on the political side, is really balancing competing political priorities, right? So while we all may agree that climate change is a large issue, it can tend to sometimes get swallowed by whatever the biggest issues that are happening of the day. I think another challenge is that people tend to get in silos, right? So business talks to business, NGOs talk to NGOs, the state talks to the state. It's very rare, and this is maybe one of the more rare policy panels where you really have everyone coming together to talk about how we could be better, not in that adversarial standpoint, but more like, okay, let's all talk and listen about what we can do to kind of have those conversations about, okay, where can we get to? Where's the state ready to get to? What's it going to cost us? not just in terms of financial, but in terms of, what are the cost benefits on the other policies that we're trying to enact in California. And then how do we get there on a political standpoint? So I think those are all super important discussions, and we're having those in California on a day-to-day basis. I can't speak to how that happens at the local level, but at least in California, I always make sure to collaborate directly with the NGOs and the state to try to figure out what we can do, right? Like what we can do, and then how do we get there?
I think that's really important. This idea that we can't work in silos. You saw Esther showing that Venn diagram in her presentation. We find that in the private sector as well. You can't operate in silos even within your business. We also saw at COP26, we saw just a much larger presence of the private sector than really ever previously. So I think there is opportunity to continue bringing these groups together. But I would love to hear from some more of our panelists, perhaps at the county level. What is happening? Where are you finding areas of success collaborating with the private sector, or what are some of your biggest challenges? I'd love to hear an answer to either of those. Maybe that's a question for Parisa.
Sure, yes. And if you wouldn't mind, Lindsay, I'd love to put on my poverty law hat instead of my commissioner hat. And I know we're going to talk about Cdaw a little bit later.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. So I really appreciated what you mentioned, Lindsay, regarding, or Esther actually, regarding not leaving people behind. So how can we together, the public and the private sector, move towards sustainability without leaving those who are the most minoritized, the most marginalized, without leaving those behind? And so as a poverty law attorney, I want to approach this from the perspective of the programs that are public-private programs that are intended to provide assurances that the basic fundamental human needs of our populations are met. And so as two really quick examples, we have housing. So the largest housing program in the United States is one that's actually reliant on the private sector. It is the voucher program. So we ensure that the low-income families are able to get a voucher and use that voucher in the private sector, which is great, private sector, public funds. However, are we ensuring that the individuals who have those vouchers, a lot of parents with kids, are we ensuring that they're able to access rental units, homes in neighborhoods that are not polluted with environmental nuisances, that are not food deserts, that are not high poverty? Tying right into that with food deserts is the food stamp program. Very similar. We have a publicly funded program with food stamps, EBT cards used in the private market. But if the majority of our most vulnerable populations, communities, are located in these high poverty, environmentally hazardous neighborhoods that are food deserts, that lack healthy, fresh food, and instead are oversupplied with processed food, then how are we bridging that gap with the potential for this public-private partnership on a granular basis? And so there's two solutions which the United Nations has identified when it comes to some of those health-based disparities, and they're excellent. One of them, of course, is just switching the incentivization. Right now, our economy in the United States and our federal government really incentivizes and subsidizes processed food and the meat and dairy industry rather than fresh produce. And so the United Nations has discussed extensively how this is an industry that's the main driver of climate change, deforestation in the Amazon, acidification of the oceans, and direct pollution of our salt and freshwater sources. And so there has been excellent progress already when it comes to the private sector leading the way in plant-based alternatives that disproportionately benefits a lot of low-income children living in poverty, and ensures positive health outcomes. So I think it's a twofold effort here. Number one is how can we change the public incentives, the public subsidies to support the transformation in the private industry, but also how can we bring the public sector along to roll out those plant-based defaults at all levels of our public schools, our hospitals, our jails, and incentivize that those private sector entities like Just Egg, Beyond, and Possible that are already leading this way in this transformation. Thank you.
That's great, and that kind of touches on one thing I wanted to ask about today. A lot of the messaging and a lot of the headlines over the past 2 years have been pretty dire. And so it's nice to also highlight areas where things are working well, where there are pockets of optimism or solutions, because ultimately the point of convening this conversation from my perspective is to look for those solutions. So you talked about one, changing incentives, like what's worked well in the plant-based industry. I'd love to hear from our panelists, other examples you could highlight where this has actually worked well, this sort of public-private partnership where you see room for further solutions. I'll open that up to our panelists.
Lindsay, I think Karen has her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't looking at the hand raising function. Thank you. Karen, go ahead.
Karen, you unmute. Can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Yes. Let's talk about the collaboration that's produced the stability and adopting policies that allow businesses and investors to plan and attract investments, manufacturing, and other businesses to the state of California with the electric vehicles. The popularity in California is not just because celebrities and the South African are driving them or making them. It's because the state has distances that are basically short enough to run on one battery charge. No, really electric vehicle ownership is steadily becoming mainstream in California because there's statewide public goals regarding electric vehicle dissemination, financial incentives available to buyers including in low-income neighborhoods, charging availability. That's really important, charging availability, and that's not only monitored and led by the state, but also in private industry providing the charging stations. And of course, making gasoline, which is at an all-time high, a less attractive option financially. So there are a host of other policies that evolve from really solid, consistent, collaborative policies and incentives to get electric cars on the road. And we can do that also on the local level, the very local level, by making sure that the ride sharing is only in hybrid or electric vehicles, that any taxis are electric or hybrid. The same with the San Francisco's Transit First policy and making sure that our public transportation vehicles are electric or hybrid. And so the question is really, how do we gain the support of the three constituencies of the government, of the community, and of course, of private industry, so that we have these kinds of success stories, because I do think that EVs are part of that success story. The biggest challenge, I did want to address that because it's always the elephant in the room, and that's CEO salaries and pay disparity, not just gender pay inequity, but that CEO pay has skyrocketed over 1,300% since 1978. Today, American CEOs are paid 351 times the average US worker. And what does this contribute to? Well, it's definitely not helping us reach our sustainable development goals, almost all 17, deal with equality, equity, and inclusion. And we can't have real progress until we address the greed. And that's part of that G in governance, ethics.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Karen. And we're definitely seeing in the private sector, we're seeing investors paying more attention to incentive compensation and making sure that they're demanding that companies increasingly are really aligning executive compensation with sustainability linked goals. So as you noted, still some ways to go there, but it is something that we're hearing talked about more. To that point that you made about the need to kind of bring together the three constituent groups, I think that's a really important one. And I'd love to hear a little bit more from Kwasi maybe on this topic, because in your introduction, you described really a range of experiences in your career. So we'd love to get your perspective on how, you've been on Wall Street, you've been in all these different roles. How do you, from your perspective, start to bring together these constituent groups?
Yeah, I mean, my training is as a diplomat. My degree from University of Pennsylvania was in politics. And so I'm a firm believer in coalition building across the board with when you're trying to address these large issues. And I think that comes down to incentivizing folks based on what their goals are, finding what that particular group really needs and addressing that directly. I think it's like any other group, any other attempt at accomplishing a goal. You have to really think about what is that stakeholder's particular need, or what's their pain point, and how can we make this transition actually benefit them in their day-to-day life. And to address your question earlier about what's my biggest sustainability challenge, when I put on my content creator hat and I think about the process of trying to fund, market, and produce content that relates to sustainability or that's telling the story of what's happening. And I saw this with the campaign we did for River of Gold, which is an amazing film about the deforestation of the Amazon, is that unfortunately corporate America, the media outlets are not necessarily that excited about positioning content around climate change in the way that they should. The financiers, the whole ecosystem, because it's not super profitable to fund documentaries and therefore to run them, there's just like a very hard road to funding these projects that are so crucial and essential to winning the hearts and minds of the next generation. And so it would be amazing if there was some alternative way to fund projects that actually have social good beyond just the traditional kind of structures that support other kinds of media.
That's really interesting. And I don't know if this is true for our other panelists, but I know that from my perspective, I sit in a big public company, and I hear a lot more businesses and investors paying attention to these kinds of topics. And sort of one of the big narratives that we heard coming out of COP26 was that there is in the private sector all of this capital, all this money, all these investors who are interested in investing in solutions to the kinds of sustainability challenges we're talking about. And then on the other side, there's certainly the need, but somehow the two to date haven't really been successfully bridged. And so I guess that's still where more work needs to be done, and more solutions need more coalition building, as you put it, needs to be done.
Lindsay, I actually, is it okay if I chime in on this point?
Please do, yes.
Just to share from my previous experience, having worked at the UN and having basically, we've for 6 years, we've basically tried to lobby the UN to accept the language on private sector as a collaborator, as not just a source of income, for example, for some of the programs, but really for the private sector to be viewed as an equal development partner. And I think it's what I can say is that just at the very basic level, I think it's just this inability for the different sectors and different sides to talk to each other and to communicate with each other in terms that the other side understands. I think it's a huge problem when it comes to this, lack of grander collaboration between public and private sectors. I think, for example, public sector organizations and organizations like the UN a lot of times simply lack the modality in terms of partnering with companies, with private sector. And private sector, of course, finally, I think the ESG movement, I think, is starting to show that it's not just a risk mitigation activity for the companies, that they are starting to understand that sustainability, in order to have a license to operate for a long term in the markets, in order to be recognized by not to have social conflict against the company in local communities, in the production sites, etc. You must think through your operations and your supply chains and your value chains, and ensure that you have that license to operate. So the companies are not just going to the UN also to have that UN logo next to them, next to their own logo, but also to understand how they can become a fully fledged partner in development. And I think we're thanks to companies like Unilever and others, kind of like this conversation has been going on for a few years, where we started to, with Paul Polman starting the conversation on, well, you know what, if your operations are not sustainable, you're not going to be able to make any, shampoos, and you're not going to have anyone to sell them to either, So we have to look at sort of like this, and this ability to translate, what's the business case behind sustainability, and also what is the business case for public sector to work with private sector in all of this. So I think we're starting to finally see this convergence, but really it's, in my opinion, a little too late, like, in the game. Like, I think we need to really step it up and really starting to build out and talk about the business case on all of the sides and what's at stake.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And to your point about Paul Pullman, I was at a conference a few weeks ago where he was one of the keynote speakers, and it was a conference that was very much private sector, looking at the state of green business. And he was addressing it in I would say almost entirely private sector audience. And then he had a follow-up session, and it was completely packed because people were really interested in what he had to say. His message was that incremental change is not going to do the trick anymore, and all these like small incremental changes are not going to work. We actually need like big system change, and I think to make that happen, that big system change really needs to do what you're talking about, Tatiana, and have private and public working together effectively.
And just my final point on that, that I think, in my view, and that's why we've started this company, is that I think disclosure is the number one huge step. Transparency and disclosure is that something that what everyone has to do as soon as possible, in terms of like looking at your own supply chain as a company and understanding what are the risks, what are the inconsistencies, what are you doing wrong within your own supply chains. And to me, that's the biggest sustainability challenge at the moment. Goes as, of course, that's also the issue with greenwashing that we're seeing in the ESG sector. So
yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, where do you think more needs to be done when it comes to disclosure? How much do you think should be voluntary disclosure versus how much should be mandatory? We're having this discussion on the day that the SEC is coming out with announcements about climate disclosure. So it's very timely, but we'd love to hear a little more of your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue, and obviously there are a lot of angles to it, but just taking, for example, the mining sector, I think to me that's a hugely important sector, again, because the energy transition is dependent on mining. We can't make electric vehicle batteries or solar panels without mining for these critical metals in mostly global south and in developing countries and emerging economies. To me, I think just having, in terms of like how much disclosure there should be, like, I mean, the more the better, I think, in that sense, but there's no accountability to ESG data at the moment. So all of the ESG data is primarily self-reported data by the companies, which of course means that they they can cherry pick certain ESGs and report on those, but really there's very little reliability in that data. So in that sense, I think there needs to be more data verification, more. I think there's a huge sector also emerging, like in terms of like geospatial data and AI-driven startups and companies. It's sort of like the ecosystem for ESG reporting that I think can really do a huge, create a huge difference in terms of availability of transparent, reliable, timely data. And I think, I think it's a conversation on its own, like in terms of like how much transparency there should be and what should be set in stone in legislation, etc. So
we'll schedule that for a whole follow-up webinar conversation. Thank you, Tatiana. Leah, I see you have your hand raised. Please jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of observations based on what folks have been talking about so far. So one of, I can speak to the environmental law and environmental policy, and I know there are a couple other lawyers on here. Law in general has a challenge. It's mostly male and mostly white, but at least in the environmental sector, I had noticed that there's a larger percentage of female and people of color practicing in environmental law. And maybe that's because it was a new policy area, or maybe that's because it was a little less insular. But I think that really brings the focus on why it's important for companies to be diversifying their hiring efforts, right? So you've got these folks who have interesting and diverse backgrounds, who think about things differently, and traditionally they haven't really had a place in the corporate world. And so as we're kind of looking forward, one of the largest hirings, so every once in a while for grins and giggles, I looked at the LinkedIn hiring page. Of course, it sends me all of the ESG hiring. And so there's a lot of ESG hiring, I think, that's happening from the nonprofit sector. So there's a really interesting collaborative happening in that regard, because most of the folks who have been working in this space and have really developed expertise in this space are coming from the NGOs and also coming from diverse backgrounds. So I think there is kind of a push forward on emphasizing not only corporations hiring ESG specialists, but also pulling from those diverse backgrounds. So I think it will happen a little naturally, but of course, we also need to recognize that there's some help that folks need to get those policies in place.
Thanks, Leah. Yeah, I would say I come from a background in financial services. I was a journalist covering the financial sector for many years. And when I moved into covering ESG and sustainability issues, the difference in just the makeup of the attendees of the conferences that I was going to was so marked. The conference I was just talking about, where Paul Pullman presented, was just so diverse in terms of age and gender and race. Whereas the banking conferences I used to go to were anything but. So I would agree with you. I'm seeing that sort of positive shift, but I also agree that it needs to be very intentional. And we're definitely seeing in the private sector a lot of companies paying more attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion in their hiring efforts. But certainly there's more that needs to be done. Parisa, you mentioned Cdaw and some of the gender diversity efforts that you've been involved in your introduction, and we're having this conversation less than 2 weeks after International Women's Day. So I'd like to spend some time focusing specifically on the topic of gender equity. And Parisa, I turn to you maybe to tell us a little bit more about the efforts that you're involved in, also some of the challenges that you're facing.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And I do want to say just thank you for your podcast. I think it was on March 7th regarding International Women's Day, and the analysis that you facilitated regarding what's happening, in the state of California and European countries. What are the differences between using carrots versus sticks, legislative requirements versus incentives? And it's really fascinating what's happening in places where they are using, the carrots and not the sticks. So I think there's certainly the potential for us to do, as a question raised in the chat mentioned, which is really consider what is most responsive to the region, to the jurisdiction where you are, so that we're, again, not leaving anyone behind. We're not leaving any communities behind in in this effort. So yes, we are incredibly excited in San Diego to be on our way to adopting a Cdaw Ordinance. So Cdaw is the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It is a core international human rights treaty that has been implemented across the globe to further gender-based justice from an intersectional framework. So we know that multiple forms of discrimination compound to disadvantage and oppress individuals, including based on race and ethnicity, immigration status, as you mentioned, disability and age. And so Cdaw promotes gender equity, intersectional gender equity in all areas of life, from economic to civil to social, political, and cultural. So in San Diego, we're excited to be working on an ordinance to achieve this intersectional gender justice in all county operations, from the administration of public benefits, including those I spoke about earlier today, to employment, promotion, recruitment, to the issuing of licenses and registrations, and through direct and indirect services. And so why is San Diego County focused on an international human rights treaty? Well, the reason for that is simple. President Carter signed Cdaw over 40 years ago, but it has not been approved by the Senate. Every country in the world, except for 6, including the US, have ratified Cdaw, so we have not. In response, many of us activists and advocates have worked on passing local Cdaw ordinances that effectively further gender equity. And so it really provides a blueprint and a framework for implementing Cdaw at the local level. And so just very briefly, I'm going to mention the 2 things that Cdaw effectively will do, or Cdaw Ordinance. Number 1, as data has been mentioned quite a bit during this presentation, which I love, I've used it in my litigation, and I think we should all rely on data because data does not lie. You cannot argue with data, although it does underrepresent, including our transgender communities, the current data that's collected in the United States. But the first of the 2 mechanisms is to conduct an ongoing intersectional gender analysis to identify inequities. So there's an ongoing effort to analyze what's happening and what the disparities look like. And then the development and implementation of action plans that are specifically responsive to those inequities. So those are the two effective triggers. And so in San Diego County, we have drafted, our commission has helped, has worked with the Office of Equity and Racial Justice to draft a Cdaw Ordinance. And it's currently being discussed and reviewed during the public comment session. So I will plug in the chat box a link to that information. And we are accepting and urging the public to participate, because unless the public, including stakeholders and community residents, including those minoritized, marginalized, and left behind by the traditional women's rights movements, unless all of us are contributing to this ordinance, it will not be an ordinance that reflects the needs of our entire community. So we're incredibly excited to know this is happening now. How this relates directly to this conversation is simple. We can look at San Francisco. So for example, San Francisco's adoption of a Cdaw Ordinance resulted in a gender-specific programming for women on probation and the allocation of street artist licenses in a way that did not disadvantage women with childcare responsibilities. In Los Angeles, on the business side, it led to a 12-fold increase, 3.6 million to 43 million, in the value of contracts awarded annually to certified women-owned business enterprises. That is the pursuit of gender justice. And I can give lots more examples, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk about Cdaw, and I'm going to plug that in the chat right now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'll just use this opportunity to also invite questions from our audience. We'll be have a little bit of time for Q&A toward the end of our discussion. Now, Karen, I saw you nodding in what looked like agreement with a lot of what Parisa was saying. Is there anything you wanted to add from your own experience here?
Yes, in San Francisco, we also have the Commission on the Status of Women, and we work collaboratively with them from the human rights side. And we're involved in this push for state legislation and US ratification of Cdaw. We're revving it up. And I think that's important for everyone listening today, that yes, all politics local, right? But we're behind in so many different ways in the US. So wherever you are, let's push to get US ratification of Cdaw. The other thing I wanted to note is that the UK has approved the full disclosure in all large corporations registered in the UK of environmental impact issues. So I think full disclosure, full transparency is the wave of the future, and the UK is leading that charge. I also wanted to just mention that there's so many local ways to address climate change. And unfortunately, there are still many places in the world that have no controls on open garbage incineration. And that was true in California 60 years ago, right? And since that ban, the air quality has changed. So it can start as small as what's happening with individual garbage, and then it moves into the corporate realm with the upcycling, the recycling, the full circle use of products in manufacturing. So start local, move global, and I think that will make a difference for us.
Great, thank you, Karen. Yeah, again, I keep coming back to the IPCC report. I think both the Cdaw and what you were just saying are great examples of how to take a local approach to global sustainability issues, like gender equity and like climate. The report puts this new emphasis on the valuable knowledge that Indigenous and local communities have about land and ecosystems they inhabit. And the report also details over a dozen examples of how local communities' knowledge and traditional practices directly apply to issues like food security, water use, and climate forecasting. So I think just finding ways to, we're talking about the need to not work in silos, the need to bring together different stakeholders. And also I think another pillar I would add to this discussion is this need to bring together the local and the global and find ways to effectively build that coalition. Quasi, again, turning to you with your diplomat hat on, perhaps, how do you think you go about creating that effective communication and coalition between local actors and those on a more global scale?
Yeah, this kind of local reality of our current moment is something that we face across the board as a marketer of any kind of product, right? You want to be able to hyper target people in their hometowns, but then also target entire geographic regions and do it with the same efficiency if you can. I think when it comes to climate, what we discussed earlier, the presentation about the diversity of the challenges, even just in the United States, between droughts, wildfires, flooding. It's I don't know what the answer is. It's really challenging. I think at the end of the day, what we need is more research. We need more resources devoted to figuring out what the solutions are. I know I lived in New Orleans in the French Quarter, and everyone talks about how New Orleans is sinking into the ocean. That was a real thing. When you think about buying real estate in New Orleans or in Miami, you have to think about, am I going to live in this place for 30 years because it might be underwater? It's really difficult with this climate stuff because the challenges are so different in each community. I think at the same time, there are consistencies that we see, say, for example, with island communities across the world that are facing the same issues. And so maybe it's about finding partners, maybe in a different country, but that are similar, dealing with similar challenges from a climate issue standpoint, as opposed to saying, well, I need to work with somebody in my own state or in my own country, because their issues might be completely different. Whereas maybe Venice and New Orleans actually have more in common when it comes to sustainability. And so I think we need to think outside of the box, and we need to think beyond just our kind of immediate communities to really think about how to address these issues globally.
Great, thanks, Kwasi. Tatiana, could I bring you in here as well? Because I'd love to get your perspective, working with geospatial analytics data as you do. I imagine you have some perspective on how to, approach the local versus the global, or I think you said global. I like that, Kwasi.
Yes, absolutely. So our approach is, I think it's, in a way, it's twofold. We take the satellite imagery that is now pretty widely available if you're willing to pay for it, which could be scary to some people, but it's actually great in terms of like tracking, let's say, deforestation, tracking the commitments of the companies that say that they are, let's say, working on reforestation, or that, let's say, they are companies that might be underreporting on their, on their carbon emissions, just even based on the the double materiality law. If anyone knows what that means, it's basically not having to report on certain production facilities if they don't fall under a certain threshold or above certain threshold. So there are sort of, so our approach is really partnering with organizations on the ground that can provide a context to the data that we're seeing from space, from above. So in that sense, we're sort of ground truthing the data. We're adding this layer of ground truth to the data to corroborate our findings in terms of, for example, we're partnering with IPEACE, which is a research institute in Congo that looks at the prevalence of armed conflict and in the area. And then we marry that data together with the satellite imagery of the mining locations, and we can look at the prevalence of armed conflict around mines. And there are certain, obviously, it's difficult to make to draw conclusions from that, but you could see that there's definitely correlation between, like, mines that are, let's say, in the areas where there's a lot of artisanal mining, which is manual mining, and that perhaps places that employ children and have very poor safety standards for workers. For example, there's definitely a correlation also with other risks associated, including armed conflict, etc. So there's all sorts of things. There are lots of ways, I think, to do this, and we're trying to think of it from a perspective of, all right, we have this data, but we need to always find the ground truth to the data as well. So it's a complex challenge.
Yeah, I would definitely second that. From my perspective, where I sit, we at S&P Global, we have a lot of data, but what we hear from our clients is that data without a narrative is kind of useless. You need to be able to explain the data in a way that makes sense to not just your scientific community, but really to a much broader audience of stakeholders. And that's what Esther and I are constantly trying to do in the podcast, put these really important stories, this really important data into context in a way that my mom could understand. I see we have a couple of raised hands. Bettina, and then I'll turn to Parisa.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. We are 15 minutes or less than 15 minutes, actually. And I wanted to honor some of the questions that are in the chat, if that's all right. And I'm starting with N. Medinas, that hopefully I pronounced the last name correctly. And I believe this is towards more the state level. So meaning maybe that's something that Leah can address. At the state level, what are the incentives to NGOs that are working to affect change with regards to climate change?
So a large part of the governor's budget each year includes a substantial amount of incentives and grant making for climate change programs. So there are a large number of programs that NGOs can apply for and engage in, and also engage through their local government entities to access those financial incentives. I mean, on the non-financial incentives, I mean, there's certainly the California government is receptive to hearing from NGOs and welcomes participation by NGOs. For example, the California Air Resources Board has placed a heavy emphasis on environmental justice this year, has an environmental justice advisory committee, and they've been heavily involved in the drafting of the California scoping plan, which is really our plan that sets out what California climate policy is going to look like over the next 10 years.
Great, thank you so much. Another question that I think is really great as well is towards the engagement of youth, and that's particular the question from UNA USA 2020. What about the intergenerational approach? How can informed youth be included? And that probably, I think that's really across sectors. That's anyone that wants to address that.
I can quickly chime in and say that I think the youth is already included. I think that there's a huge movement that we're seeing. It's the greatest wealth transfer, where we're now, millennials and younger people are now sort of driving, including in financial markets. Starting, like the retail trading is now trading is a lot more prevalent, and people really do vote with their money, and young people are making a huge splash, I think. And that's why that's one of the reasons why we saw the ESG explode the way it did, because we've been pushing for it for decades, but it wasn't until really young people got into investing and trading that they really started to push for it.
Thanks, Tatiana. Anyone else that want to chime in?
Yeah, well, I love the idea. We saw the UN on TikTok, I think this Sangha for the first time, which was painful, but it was interesting just to see the attempt of trying to leverage this, kind of new medium of communication. And I love experiments like that. As I mentioned earlier, I created one of the first groups on Clubhouse to really focus on sustainable development. And we see that topic and topics around geopolitics, some of the most actively discussed topics on platforms like Twitter Spaces and Clubhouse. And so I think going to where the kids are, if you will, is the right way and the right approach. They're not going to come to you. You have to kind of speak their language, and platforms like TikTok and others are definitely where they are.
Thank you. Lindsay, are there any other question that you may have seen, or I had one of the comments that I actually find very interesting, and it's from Heather Oxman. Is it really true that NGOs and CSO lack the modality to work well with corporate sector?
That's a great question. I'd be really interested to hear from our panelists, their perspective on that.
I mean, I don't think that's true. I think that, we work with NGOs and local entities on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I'll give the example that Karen gave, which is zero emission vehicles in California. So, we engaged with the environmental groups and environmental justice groups several years ago and supported the Advanced Clean Trucks rule, which is the first. It was a first in the rule that required the phase-in of manufacturing of zero emission vehicles. And that really was a collaborative approach between the environmental groups, the business community, and the state. So I think that there's certainly ways to do it. It's just whether everyone can be receptive to and open to speaking to each other. And that involves kind of breaking down those silos, breaking down those bubbles that we tend to get in and only talk to ourselves.
Perhaps I can correct myself by saying that what I meant was the UN in particular. The UN, I think, has a pretty strict process for partnering with private sector in particular. And I've been through many hells of trying to procure a partnership or collaboration at the UN, and it was difficult. It might be changing going forward, but historically it's been very, very difficult.
I think historically the concern had to do with an ethical concern about corruption and undue influence of the money. So back to the greed in that particular G. But as we move forward in thinking more collaboratively and also how to have ethical safeguards, then we can move forward with including the private sector more openly in our international organizations.
That's great. I wonder if some of the same collaborative approach could be used to address one of the other questions we've had come in chat, which is how do we get plastic reduced at the industry level? Penalties for plastic packaging should be on the provider, not the consumer, is what our question says. So I'd love to get your thoughts here from some of our panelists about how do you address this specific problem, and are there any takeaways from other challenges, like you mentioned, Leah, with electric vehicles that could maybe be applied to plastic?
In my mind, it's all about the petroleum lobby. I think sustainability needs as much lobbying as the companies do, so lobbying for environmental sustainability across all the issues to the government, to the companies. So
especially when we're looking at plastics, because so many of our SDGs go to life under the sea, preserving the oceans, dealing with hunger and pollution, and having sustainable cities. And all of that is antithetical really to the proliferation of plastic. I really appreciate Tatiana talking about that it's about the petroleum industry, it's about the fossil fuel industry continuing this tack, because often their lobbying is completely antithetical to the SDGs. And we have to call it out. We have to have integrity and speak up about it.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Karen and Tatiana, because I do think when we're talking about lobby, we cannot forget the consumer. We cannot forget our own behavior in terms of single-use plastic. And I'm trying constantly to go to the grocery store to get something that isn't wrapped in plastic or that doesn't have plastic, where you need to have some kind of a container to put it together when you have forgotten to bring a little paper bag or something from home, right? So that's where CSO comes in. I do think organizations such as ours, the UN Association, there's Rotary clubs, there's so many different clubs within our communities that we as consumers and we as civil society, as real residents, right, need to push, be it with our representatives or a cafe shop is opening up and they're again using plastic cups for just water, to really say, I'm a neighbor here. How is it possible you're still using plastic that will be landing on the landfill? So we really need to wrap up. I'm so sorry to make it really, because it's a very interesting conversation, and I see great feedback from our audience that has participated throughout with the chat. If there's anything, Lindsay, that you see is a question that we should address, perhaps, I'm sorry, I just saw one actually popping up that came from Christina in terms of if the panel could address how do we close the gender gap within, in general, because when we're talking about environmental impact, when we're talking about crisis, who is most impacted are women at the end of the day, right? And so how do we close the gap within our specific industries? And how can we do our part in terms of assisting on that to really bring more women into the leadership with that more thoughtful about environmental degradation and the use of our resources? Anyone wants? Okay.
I think that when we're looking at gender inequality and pay equity, we really have to require all corporations to do audits and to determine both the job classifications, whether the job classifications are heavily weighted in one gender or the other, how they are comparable in terms of productivity and contribution to the bottom line. And we have to look at this C-suite compensation versus even the next level, whether it's middle management as well as the lowest paid person in the corporation. So if we require audits, if we have full transparency, if the data is disaggregated and the job classifications are really analyzed, then we can start to make some adjustments so that there is pay equity.
Absolutely, I completely agree with Karen's perspective, and just bringing it back to this Cdaw movement. Data is key, transparency is key, and accountability is key. Only when we can see the disparities can we take steps to identify the barriers causing those disparities, so that with surgical precision, we can go in and remove those barriers so that we can further gender justice. That is what Cdaw envisions. And I just want to mention as well, Cdaw from 40 years ago is not what folks think of when they see Cdaw implementation today. There is a committee, a Cdaw committee of 23 independent experts globally that are looking at and creating a modern and responsive recommendation strategy to achieve gender justice in all of these areas, including climate change. So General Recommendation 37 spoke specifically to addressing disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change. And just very briefly, I see in the chat box, we have some tremendous leaders with us today from Cities for Cdaw, for WIN, from League of Women Voters. The NGO CSW this year included sessions from the UNA USA San Francisco on Cdaw ratification from last Monday, on the Cdaw challenge under Nancy Bermau from Thursday. And I encourage folks to certainly tune into those to hear from experts in the field of gender justice through the Cdaw implementation.
Thank you, Parisa, for the shout out to our panel and of course to our attendees that are really from around the United States, from Canada. I saw some from Italy, Hawaii, or friends from Hawaii, of course, as well. Lindsay, I want to hand it over to you for final, maybe final remarks before we conclude our panel.
I would just reiterate your thanks to our panelists for a great discussion today. I feel like we've only scratched the surface, and I don't know how an hour and a half has passed, and I feel like I already have several follow-up conversations that I hope I can have with all of you. We heard a lot about some of the challenges, the political challenges, challenge of misaligned incentives, of pay disparity, and also opportunities when it comes to improving data quality and the availability of data. We talked a little bit about the really important role of local communities, and of course, the importance of continuing to find solutions, ways to build those coalitions between private and public sector. So I hope this is just the beginning of what will be a lot of further conversations, and thank you for letting me take part today.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Are there any final thoughts from any of our panelists? Maybe something, what do you wish we would have asked you? Karen, I put you on the spot.
Okay, put me on the spot. I will only say that while climate change is a physical phenomenon, addressing it is a societal action. We must take action, and it's best addressed through collaboration, not just by government, but through collaboration with government, academia, and the private sector. Business has to step up because clean water, clean air, and species protection all demand civic engagement.
Thank you. Parisa.
Thank you so much, Bettina. I second everything Karen mentioned, especially regarding species. You know, this world, this globe is not ours. It's not ours to use. We call them natural resources, which is concerning. Those are not our resources to consume. So I think it's so important that the private and public sector come together to really ensure and center the needs of the most minoritized and marginalized communities, while also understanding and respecting how we can pursue climate change protections, climate change. We can fight against climate change by doing simple things like changing the incentives from meat and dairy industry to plant-based eating, and ensuring that we're really focusing and centering efforts that accelerate our ability to rely on a world that is free from using the resources of our globe in a way that contributes rather than mitigates greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you, Parisa. Tatiana, I know you have a little one running around there, so I want to.
I just wanted to add that I wish these questions were a lot easier. These are very, very overwhelming, difficult questions and issues that we're dealing with, and I just wanted to call everyone to action to continue sort of influencing in their own spheres of influence in their life, whether it's through, personally, through work, through your companies, call out to your local leaders. I think it's important not to give up. I know the world seems like a very gloomy place these days, but just continue pushing for positive impact in your own life, and the world will be a better place eventually.
Thank you, Tatiana. Leah.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for their comments and their insights today. Obviously, it's always helpful for us to hear from different perspectives. And I want to continue to offer to be an open door to listen and to hear what the community's needs are and what the NGOs' needs are. Like I said, I come from a different background than probably most folks that are dealing with these issues on the business side. So I'd hope that you'd encourage folks to come talk to me, and hopefully we can address the climate crisis together.
A big shout out, Leah, to you and Jennifer at the California Chamber of Commerce, because we really reached out such a short notice. I think we gave you 2 days and you were so enthusiastic. Thank you so much really for joining. This has been really incredible, meaningful. Kwasi, you have the floor.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for this opportunity to share a little bit with everyone here. I've learned a lot today. It's been a really great experience. And for those of you who want to explore using some technology, bleeding edge technology, to share your message with a broader audience, let's have those conversations. You know, winning hearts and minds is going to be key to us all accomplishing our shared goals. And so let's brainstorm how to do that and put some things into action.
Thank you, Kwasi. And Lindsay, I want to give you also the floor if there's any final thoughts.
Nothing further from me. Just thank you all again for your time.
Thank you so much for really have this professional moderation. It's amazing to have you moderating together with Esther, and we keep following. Esther, there you are. Hello. Esther, do you maybe have a final thought, because you kept really in the background?
No, I'm just, the one thing I heard from this, I heard a lot of really great stuff, but I think the importance of thinking about, empathy is probably the wrong word, but thinking from the perspective of who you're trying to coordinate with, right? You talk about this language barrier between the two. So understanding the incentives of whoever you're talking with when you're trying to partnership with them, and speaking in those terms so that they understand by their terms, right, how that works, both whether you're talking as a company with an NGO or an NGO to a community or to government or whatever. And I think the more we kind of think in those terms and try to understand each other, which I'm kind of getting from this panel, the more we can actually kind of make these big changes happen.
Yeah, thank you. Well said, because that's what really was it about, right? We heard about ESG, we heard about SDGs, and sometimes we're talking about the same things, but we're using different terminologies. So to understand that ESG is really a translation of the SDGs into the business context will give us a better understanding. How can we actually talk to one another when we talk about sustainability, to hold each other accountable at the same time, right? Because we're talking about the same things. In that regard, I really want to quote one of my good friends who put it in a chat here, Kath. She said what she heard was incentives, disclosure, policies. So in that point, to wrap it all up, thank you so much for joining us. We will continue the conversation on Clubhouse. Kwasi and I are already thinking about putting that into a continued conversation on Clubhouse, because that was a first of this kind. So we definitely want to continue the conversation and make it broader on Clubhouse. So please keep an eye out, and thank you to the panel. Thank you for the team, Christina, Nancy, Nadia, that helped in getting this panel together. Thank you all for your time. We really appreciate you taking the time. And Fabrice, who was in the background translating in French, thank you so much. We truly appreciate and wish you a good day. And let's continue our work on making this really a sustainable and just world for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.